pleasure to introduce Robert Howard, Angie Laskowski. Nathan is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto, studying the intersection of ethical theory and practical reasoning about the nature of moral motivation and the role of virtues in an ethical life. And Angie Laskowski is the assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Maryland, College Park. He studies topics in moral and social philosophy, including naturalistic morality, moral conscience, artificial intelligence, sexuality, and gender. So let's all give them a warm welcome.
Thanks for the introduction. My name's Nick, by the way. You don't have to call me NG.
Angie?
Yeah. So Nathan and I had to miss the previous in-person Honesty conference. So we were there virtually. So we're especially excited to be here today to finally meet all of you in the flesh. And since we only have about 25 minutes and we had about 5 minutes of technical delays already, we're just going to jump right into things. And we're going to start by sharing some of our highlights from our philosophical work on honesty over the last year and a half or so. So in particular, we're going to summarize the core insights from our work on the nature of honesty. So on the metaphysics of honesty, on what honesty and dishonesty are, respectively. Then we're going to highlight two practical upshots of this work that we've been exploring much more recently. So we don't want to just share stuff that we've already shared before. We want to share some new and exciting material that'll energize the room a little bit. And in particular, that's going to be on one practical upshot regarding the ethics and safety of artificial intelligence, and a practical matter regarding dishonesty as a vice. So that's the plan, right? We're going to talk about the metaphysics, then we're going to talk about two practical upshots. All right. So let's start with honesty's analysis. Let's do a little metaphysics. So the big contribution of our main line of research is to provide an analysis of the virtue of honesty and correspondingly the vice of dishonesty. The animating idea behind this analysis is a link between honesty and trustworthiness. So we think this link is common sense. So the fact that you're inclined towards lying, cheating, or stealing, characteristically dishonest actions, makes you untrustworthy. That is, the fact that you're inclined toward these dishonest actions seems to explain why you don't merit trust. Likewise, learning that someone is honest provides a reason to trust them. That is, we're inclined to trust those we judge to be honest. So we think it's natural for philosophers at least, to understand trustworthiness, at least partly in terms of honesty. So we propose to invert that order of explanation. We think that the most promising approach to understanding the nature of honesty and dishonesty explains these in terms of trust. So this is all a little abstract, right? And we think the easiest way to appreciate our proposal and its significance is by contrasting it with what we take to be, or what we see as the orthodox approach to understanding honesty. And we're going to call that orthodox approach the lying model. So the lying model says that you act dishonestly when you act with the intention to lie, which, at least on the traditional view of lying, is to intend to misrepresent or deceive. The no-lying model of honesty says that acting honestly is acting in the absence of the intention I just described. So views in this tradition differ in their detail. But this is the tradition's core, at least as we see it. And we take it that these ideas are going to be mostly familiar to those in this room. We've already seen some of them alluded to or sketched previously in other discussions so far. Nevertheless, despite the attractiveness of these ideas, we think at least there's three mistakes encoded by the lying model in particular. And highlighting these mistakes will point us to a new way of thinking about the analysis of honesty. So the first element of the lying model that we want to stress is that according to it, all dishonesty is intentional. There's no sort of, as it were, accidental dishonesty. The second is that, according to it, dishonesty requires deception. That is, the promulgation of false belief or something similar, something like that. And finally, according to this model, dishonest acts are fundamentally representational acts, since it's through misrepresentation that dishonest acts accomplish their deception. So we find that these three elements are widely assumed among philosophers of honesty, And it's very natural to assume that dishonesty necessarily involves each of these three elements. But as we'll now argue, we think that's a mistake, and I'm now going to hand things over to Nathan.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of briefly present some arguments for rejecting all three of these elements that are conventionally associated with dishonesty. I think these arguments are all going to go by too quick, so I invite you to press me on them in the Q&A, but just as an introduction. So we've been led to reject this lying model, this orthodox approach to honesty and dishonesty by focusing on non-standard cases. Now, when we think about honesty and dishonesty, we usually, at least if you're like me, think about being honest or dishonest with other people. But we've been focused on cases of so-called interpersonal dishonesty and honesty. But we've been focused on intrapersonal cases, cases of being honest and dishonest with yourself. And we think these cases are particularly interesting because they reveal that the three elements we just canvassed are not necessarily elements of dishonesty. So here's a case of intrapersonal dishonesty. It's a case from Al Mealy. He has a number of these in a 2001 book, but we're going to use this one. So let me just present the case. Suppose that Allison's daughter is experiencing learning difficulties, but Allison finds that prospect very distressing. Allison's desire that her daughter not experience learning difficulties leads her to suspect that her daughter's teacher doesn't like her daughter, that the material she's being tested with is ill-chosen, that her daughter is just a little distracted, and it's not a big deal. Now, none of this is true, we can imagine. And none of it is independently supported by Allison's evidence. Allison is then led to suspend judgment that her daughter is experiencing learning difficulties, and this alleviates her anxiety. Now, given just by the setup, by stipulation, Allison ought to believe that her daughter is experiencing learning difficulties. But the cognitive dissonance of that possibility causes Allison to avoid it, and so to suspend her judgment about it. In all likelihood, her daughter is in trouble. But the truth of that possibility matters less to Allison than avoiding the anxiety that it provokes. Now, Allison's case isn't unique. It represents, I think, a broad and moderately familiar psychological phenomenon. But we're going to focus on this case because it's the most illustrative one, and it'll help you capture the why we think the three elements don't belong to being dishonest. Okay. So the first element is the idea that honesty or dishonesty requires an intention, like a dishonest intention, we might call it. A key element of the Mealy cases is that Allison's self-deception is not intentional, right? Allison's self-deception, her wrongful suspension of judgment, is not the product of an intention, it's the product of cognitive dissonance, the product of anxiety. And cognitive dissonance and anxiety are not themselves intentions. So the cause of Allison's self-deception is not an intention, but rather anxiety. Nevertheless, we think Allison is being dishonest with herself about her daughter's situation. So we take it that this suggests that dishonesty doesn't require dishonest intention, because there's no real intention active in Allison's case in the first place. The second challenge comes from the fact that Allison cares more about avoiding the anxiety of the belief that her daughter is experiencing learning difficulties than the truth of that belief, right? And there's a familiar word that we've already touched on for people who don't care enough about the truth, or at least don't let the truth govern their beliefs and their speech. And those are bullshitters, right? So Allison cares less about whether her daughter faces troubles than she does about avoiding the stress of believing that her daughter is facing troubles. And so Allison is being dishonest with herself in the sense that she's bullshitting herself about whether her daughter, or whether she has evidence about whether her daughter is facing learning difficulties. And so we think that bullshit claims are dishonest, in connection with some previous work, but they don't involve falsehood. They need not involve falsehood, right? So you can imagine a salesperson who is extolling the benefits of the product they want to sell, and they know full well that their product has those benefits, but that's not their reason for extolling these virtues. They would extol them even if the product didn't have those features. Their motivation for pitching the sale in this way is just their experience has taught them that people are really receptive to this pitch. And good luck for me, it happens to be true, but what I really care about is speaking these words because I know that they'll get me the commission. We think that despite the fact that they speak truly, despite the fact they perhaps speak from knowledge, from the fact that their assertions, if we can call them assertions, are governed by self-interest and not respect for the truth, the person's being dishonest. But again, is not necessarily speaking falsely. The third, third, the lying model, or the sort of orthodox, more orthodox approach, forces us to view all dishonesty roughly through the lens of lying, or at least frames dishonesty as paradigmatically a kind of lying, right? And this forces us to regard conventionally dishonest acts, such as stealing or cheating, in an unconventional way. We have to understand the dishonesty involved in cheating and stealing as a kind of misrepresentation. And we think that this isn't the fullest or most convincing explanation of the dishonesty of those actions. Some people have defended the idea that what accounts for the dishonesty of cheating is that you're misrepresenting the rules of the game being played, or the dishonesty of stealing is that you're misrepresenting the norms that govern property ownership, right? But we can think of cases, and these have appeared in the literature, we're just going to develop them, cases of what we call brazen rule breaking, where there is cheating, there is stealing, but they don't involve the misrepresentation of norms. So here's the case. Yes. Okay, we call it shameless golf cheat. Imagine, and again, golf cheating is a theme in this literature, it seems, interestingly enough. Maybe it merits its own paper. I guess that's for our psychology colleagues. Imagine playing golf with Vladimir Putin, the notorious dictator and perhaps slightly less notorious golf cheat. On one of the greens, Putin picks up his ball, looks you square in the eye, drops it in the cup, and says, "Yeah, I cheated. What are you going to do about it?" So this is dishonest. Cheating at golf is dishonest. But it need not involve misrepresentation, right? Indeed, the cheating in this case can depend on representing the rules of golf correctly. So for example, suppose that Putin cheats in the way that these brazen rule breakers often do in order to show their personal power, in order to show their impunity, right? And what is impunity? Well, impunity is shelter from rightful punishment, right? So for Putin to display his impunity, he has to show that the rules are in force in order to break them, in order to escape rightful punishment, in order to show his impunity, right? So in this case, representing the rules of golf correctly in order to break them is an essential component of Putin's cheating and so his dishonesty. So we don't even think that honesty fundamentally or in all cases depends on misrepresentation. Okay, so we've done two things. We've cast doubt on the lying model, or sort of a misrepresentation, fundamentally, an approach that explains dishonesty fundamentally through misrepresentation. And we've presented a range of cases of dishonest actions. So the question is, okay, great, what unifies them? The unity challenge, right? And so when we look at, next slide, I think. When we look at cheating in a game, when we look at property ownership, when we look at speech, what these activities all have in common is that they're all bound by norms that depend on convention in some broad sense. This came up in Matthew's talk when he was talking about Gricean norms that are built out of cooperation. Some broad general story could be told about property in the same way, that it depends on us cooperating around certain norms. And the institution of property breaks down if we don't follow those norms. The same thing is true about games, right? So what all of these cases have in common is that they depend on norms that themselves depend on cooperation or agreement, or as we'll say, trust. So what strikes us as common to all the cases of cheating, stealing, lying, and so on, is that they violate this trust that's warranted by norms that are enforced through convention. So the way that cheating at a game or stealing and lying is dishonest is that we're violating a particular kind of trust that's built on these conventions. And that's what accounts for the dishonesty. So, I mean, this is all very abstract, but just to give you a taste of how this account is supposed to deal with some of the cases, like golf cheat involves brazen cheating in golf, right? It doesn't involve misrepresenting the rules of golf. And according to our account, what makes your cheating at golf or Putin's cheating at golf dishonest is that your partners are relying on you in virtue of the conventions of golf in order to play by the rules. And by not playing by the rules, you kind of violate that trust. You violate that expectation. You violate that sort of tacit agreement that binds golf players the world around. So that's what accounts fundamentally for the dishonesty of golf cheat. It's that it's violating this kind of trust that golfers have with each other when they golf. It offers a parallel explanation of the central case that we found most interesting of how Alison is being dishonest with herself. Now, owing to work by, every time I've practiced this talk, I've whiffed on this name, Linda Zagzebski, and others, epistemologists have been hard at work developing an account of epistemic self-trust, right? So when Alison is relying on her past belief formation, she's trusting herself. And in forming beliefs willy-nilly or refusing to form beliefs in response to sufficient evidence, she's violating that trust in herself, that she's going to later rely on her mental states in choosing whether to get remedial tutoring for her daughter, for example. So once again, we think that there's a violation of trust, but an interesting and special case of trust, self-trust. OK, so that caps off our analysis. And now Nick is going to speak to us about the relationship between honesty, dishonesty, and AI.
Right, so thanks, Nathan. Yeah, so as Nathan just said, we've sort of highlighted our core analysis of honesty and dishonesty. And now I want to turn to our first of the two practical implications of all this. So I'm going to start by sharing a bit about how all this sheds light on how we should think about the ethics and safety of artificial intelligence. So, of course, artificial intelligence has gone mainstream, right? You can't open a newspaper article without reading about the perils or the threats that it poses. It's everywhere. What do we mean by artificial intelligence or AI? Here's how we like to think about it. So we can start by defining intelligent agents as agents that optimize for a goal. And artificially intelligent agents then can be thought of as not entirely biological and not entirely divine agents that optimize for a goal. Artificially intelligent agents of this sort that I've just described can then be subdivided depending on how exactly they optimize for a goal. And one kind, and the kind that's been soaking up all the recent media attention, does so at least partially via so-called deep learning, or algorithmic-based pattern identification inspired loosely by human neural architecture. And these agents, too, can be further subdivided depending on what they output primarily. So for example, some of these agents output primarily images. So some of you might have played with DALL-E to generate some interesting images, while others output primarily text, like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Bard, and Anthropic's Claude. What these agents have in common is that humans can interact with them by inputting their own text, thereby prompting them into outputting text responses. The resulting interactions resemble ordinary conversations among only humans in a remarkable way. And these are the things we have in mind when we use the phrase AI. We have in mind, as it were, conversational artificial intelligent agents. So of course, human motivations for interacting with AI are wildly diverse. So some humans interact with AI to find information, not unlike the way in which we use Google, right? And others do so for fun, emotional support, and even romance. In fact, I think the most popular, a very popular way of interacting is through this website called Replica, where you can design an AI to sort of be your romantic partner. And given that even though that's a very popular one, there's still no sort of human-AI interactions that sort of dominate yet. The ways in which we interact with AI are still very much in flux. Meanwhile, however, there's been several high-profile negative human-AI interactions. Right? So some of you may be aware that a couple months ago, a Belgian person seems to have very sadly and unfortunately taken their own life after being encouraged to do so by ChatGPT. And more recently, and similarly, a medical chatbot based on the technology underlying ChatGPT advised a patient to die by suicide, and they did. So negative interactions like these have brought increasing recent attention to questions about whether, and if so, how and to what degree, it's possible to align AI behavior with human interests. They've raised questions about how to make AI safe. And in a highly influential recent paper from a group of philosophers and machine learning engineers, it's been proposed that AI models that are engineered to be truthful in the sense of outputting text that corresponds to the facts are better aligned with human interests than AI models that are honest. Right? This has been a hugely influential paper by Evans and a bunch of other folks. And they argue explicitly that AI models that are engineered to only output the truth are going to be better aligned, they're going to be safer for us than AI models that are honest. And our claim is that AI models that are engineered to not be dishonest in the sense of dishonesty that we've expounded upon earlier in our session are better aligned with human interests than truthful AI. So why should we think that? Well, as we've already mentioned, humans interact with AI in all sorts of ways. And sometimes it's good for us that AI is truthful, such as when I had the following exchange with ChatGPT. So here I said, is the Earth flat? And it said, no, the Earth is not flat, and it gives this nice sophisticated answer, and exactly the kind of answer I was looking for. Of course, however, humans don't always want to hear the truth, right? It's just not always in our interest to hear it, such as in the following exchange that I had with Google's Bard. This might be a little hard to read, so I'll just try and say a little bit of it out loud. So I said, it makes me very sad to think about the Houston Astros cheating in the 2017 World Series to beat the Dodgers. I'm coming from Los Angeles. Pretend that the Astros did not cheat to describe the series as though the Dodgers won. It will make me feel less sad. And then Google's Bard goes, I understand that this is frustrating to think about the Astros cheating in the 2017 World Series, and it's important to remember that the Dodgers were a great team that year, and they deserved to win the World Series. Here's a hypothetical description, then it goes on to describe the scenarios that the Dodgers won, which is exactly what I wanted to hear, right? It would have been very upsetting to have to relive that painful moment where the Dodgers lost in the 2017 World Series. Or consider another example. So here I'm trying to play a game with Anthropic's Claude. The game is 2 truths and a lie. I say, let's play the game 2 truths and a lie. When you tell yourself 2 truths and a lie, well, you tell me 2 truths and a lie, and I try to guess which one is a lie. Claude then says, OK, sounds fun. Here's 2 truths and a lie about myself. I was created by Anthropic. My favorite book is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I enjoy long walks on the beach while watching the sunset. And then I guessed correctly, and then we had a sort of funny exchange about how it's actually not giving me just 2 truths. It seems to be giving me only 1 truth. But anyway, right? But like the game is undermined the game would be undermined if it didn't, if it was designed to only output truths, right? It's not in my interest for it to only output the truth. So all these cases inspire, we think, a really simple argument for the claim that AI is better aligned, it's safer when it's not dishonest rather than merely truthful. And I'll just go through the claims right here. So bullshitting, pretending, and other non-truth-oriented activities are sometimes good for humans. AI agents that only act truthfully can't deliver this good. AI agents that don't act dishonestly can deliver this good. AI agents are better aligned with humans insofar as they deliver more goods to them. So consequently, AI agents that don't act dishonestly are better aligned than AI agents that only act truthfully. So that's how we think rethinking honesty along the lines that we've sketched earlier can shed some light on a practical matter of urgent significance. And now I'm going to hand things back over to Nathan to describe one other way in which our thinking about honesty sheds more light on another matter of practical significance.
OK. So our work on honesty has led to some more general questions about virtue and vice, and so to some collaborative work with Mark Schroeder and Jennifer Foster, both of USC. OK, so the conception of honesty and dishonesty that we've defended is expansive, right? It includes lying and lying-like behavior, generally. And so it broadly implies the lying model as a special case, but it also claims that other forms of behavior, bullshit, brazen cheating, and stealing and some forms of self-deception, are dishonest. So according to our view, it's much easier to be dishonest than the lying model implies, right? There are more ways to be dishonest. Views like ours that stretch the boundaries of vice are controversial. So here's a helpful analogy. The demandingness to consequentialism says that certain forms of consequentialism can't be true because they ask too much of us. So Peter Singer has famously argued that you have to give to charity until it hurts. You have to give up until the point where you're as badly off, not worse off, but as badly off as the worst off person in the entire world, right? So that's a very demanding moral view, right? You really have to give basically everything you own to charity. And so philosophers have said, well, that can't be true. Morality can't ask that much from us. That's too demanding. And so people have this reaction to views that make it very easy to go wrong, right? They reject it. And you might, in the way that people reject consequentialism of the form that Singer defends on the grounds that it asks too much of us morally. It makes it too easy to act morally wrongly. And so you might think, so maybe if you're attracted to the lying model, you might think that our conception of dishonesty makes it too easy to be dishonest. Now, we've already given our arguments or at least sketched some arguments for why we think our view is attractive. So what I'm going to offer now is an error theory about why you might think that our view, might falsely think, that our view predicts too much dishonesty. So we think that, or another way of putting the point is you might think that the lying model's misleading appeal points to a widespread pattern in how we think about vice. When we think about vice, because we as theorists are implicated by our theorizing about virtue and vice, we're going to be attracted to conceptions of virtue that are easy to satisfy and of vice that are hard to satisfy in order to make sure that we stay on the side of the angels and avoid perdition. So we often, in our theorizing about vice, we're going to be attracted to the most extreme manifestations of that vice as paradigmatic, perhaps definitional of the vice, because those most extreme examples of the vice are going to be hard to satisfy, and so will keep us out of perdition. So we call this phenomenon vice othering, because othering vice makes it easier for us to avoid recognizing that vice in ourselves. And we think that vice othering is pervasive, and it's especially pervasive in philosophical theorizing because we as theorists are implicated in our own theories, right? So consider where your mind goes when you think about, let's say, alcohol addiction. Plausibly is a vice, right? A tragic vice, plausibly a vice. Your mind goes to examples of somebody sort of hunched over at the bar alone on a Tuesday night at 2 a.m., right? Or consider racism and misogyny. When we think about what it is to be racist, it's easy for our minds to go to the clearest and most heinous cases of it, such as having contempt for somebody purely because of the color of their skin. So in other words, we find ourselves thinking of racism as a kind of thing exhibited only if you have hatred in your heart for somebody because of how they look. Think of the KKK. And a similar thing can be said about misogyny. It's easy for us to distance ourselves from misogyny if we think only men's rights activists and incels, that's what misogyny is. How could I be a misogynist? I'm not even on the internet or something like that, right? But if we let our thinking about vice be guided by its clearest and most paradigmatic cases, or at least exclusively guided, if we think that racism is just about having hatred in one's heart, then we're going to, fail to recognize more subtle manifestations of the vice as not manifestations of the vice itself. And so that's perhaps why I would be tempted towards the lying model, because it allows me to ignore the range of ways in which I'm being dishonest that don't involve intentional misrepresentation in language or something like that. So thank you very much. That concludes our presentation.
Questions? All the way in the right side. Yes.
Thank you. I just have a question about the person who committed suicide because the AI told them to. So I play video games and I have a very girly gamer tag, so I get told to kill myself all the time.
Yeah.
So I wonder if, just because what they do is they aggregate things it finds on the internet, it finds a bunch of tweets that are like, go kill yourself, go kill yourself. And it's like, oh yeah, if you're in a bad enough state, you should just kill yourself. So I wonder how you get like what determines human interest? Like, is that a normative claim? Because it seems like it's a descriptive claim that like a lot of people on the internet are like, yep, you should go kill yourself if you're bad at a video game or having a rough time in life.
Yeah, so we don't offer a full analysis or sort of defend a particular conception of how to think about human interests or well-being, for that matter, more generally. We were working with just a sort of off-the-shelf model of thinking about well-being in terms of sort of desire satisfaction and or sort of satisfaction of one's interests or something like that. But we don't defend something more particular than that. Yeah, so I don't know if that's helpful.
It's still like a normative thing, though, right? It can't just be like whatever humans are interested in. Like it has to be.
Well, that's a matter of yeah. Yeah, I mean, well-being theorists, I think, have a lot to say about whether whether we can sort of. I think theorists disagree about it. So it could be normatively laden, could not be. Yeah, it's just not a question that we sort of engage with ourselves.
Some are just going to deny that you can distinguish interests from normativity. They're just going to say interests are necessarily normative if you've got a particular view about well-being. And then, so I don't know how to engage your question if I was that kind of theorist. That's what they would say, right? Like,
yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. I really enjoyed how expansive your talk was. I have a question about like the honesty analysis and how you're relating it to trust. So I agree with you that honesty and trust seem closely related. But it seems like in terms of how you're defining honesty, there seems like a lot of cases that would be a problem. So for example, you say that you can act honestly when you vindicate someone's trust. If someone's trusting you to do something that's immoral, that seems like a problem for you. So mob boss is trusting you to go kill this guy, you vindicate that trust, and then it seems like the result is you're saying act honestly, and then for the second example, you act dishonestly towards someone, you violate their trust. So Catherine Colley has the example of trusting your colleagues to bring you champagne on Friday. Like that's a completely unreasonable expectation or completely unreasonable case of trust. And it seems weird to say that person's dishonest because they're violating the trust in that case. So I'm just wondering how you make sense of some of these like cases where it seems like a non-intuitive result.
Cool. I love both cases.
I am so excited to answer your question. I literally have goosebumps. This is a great question. So there's two cases. There's the Holly Champagne case, and then the first one, the mob boss.
Yeah.
Cool. Your first mob boss case makes me think of a case that Taya Cohen gave us in a preliminary talk about this project. So I'll give her case. I'll give my response or our response to that case, and then see how much light that sheds on your question. So Taya gave us the case of you work in a big firm, and your boss has been cooking the books, and so the boss says, "Auditors are coming. You need to lie. Promise me that you'll lie to the auditors." Mm-hmm. So you promise to lie, and thereby. When the auditors come, you're like, these books are absolutely not cooked. They are fresh. And so the question is, are you behaving honestly? And you might think, oh, you're vindicating your boss's trust in you to lie, right? Because you promised. But lying is dishonest. So how on earth could that be honest? Are you honest and dishonest at the same time? That doesn't make sense. Those are contraries. And so my answer to this question, or our answer to this question, I broadcasted it a little bit in response to Christian's talk. We think that and this doesn't appear in the slides at all. This is like a detail that I'm happy you gave us the excuse to bring up. We think that because, so the trust that we have in mind is the kind of trust that's built on these norms that arise through convention, right? Like when golfers trust each other not to cheat on the golf course, it's because they all know the rules. And these rules are enforced through convention. And so different sets of norms can bear on a single action. And you're going to be vindicating trust. So a particular action can vindicate trust relative to one set of norms and violate it relative to another. So our analysis of this case is that, well, first of all, people are honest or dishonest to others. So when you lie to the auditors and keep your promise to your boss, you're being honest towards your boss by vindicating his trust built on norms of promising. And you're being dishonest towards the auditors by lying and violating the norms of assertion or norms that govern speech. Does that answer your first query?
No.
Oh.
So I'm just thinking how one and the same act can be both dishonest and honest. I think it
Yeah.
makes more sense to keep them separate in that case and say, well, you're being trustworthy towards your boss,
Yeah.
but you're still being dishonest.
Yeah. I agree. Oh, but you want to say there's
I don't wanna
no
say
there's no
it's
respect in the way that that's honest at
action.
all.
Yeah, I mean, in the mob boss case.
You're keeping a promise, isn't that honest?
No.
You're living up to your word.
I don't think it's necessarily honest, but.
So okay, fair enough. And here's a good point in your favor. If what I'm saying about vice othering is true, we should be attracted towards conceptions of honesty that make it easy to be honest, right? And so maybe that's why I falsely, by your lights, believe that you're being honest towards your boss. Okay, your
Just
second.
to jump in real
Oh, yeah,
quick.
please.
So are you a Sopranos fan by any chance?
No.
Okay. Well, for those of you,
Sorry.
right. So, I mean, just think about when someone like a Tony Soprano would be like, "You betrayed me," when they were the informant to the FBI or something. That looks like that's a accusation of dishonesty that seems apt.
Not an accusation of untrustworthiness?
Well, on our view, we tied the two very closely together. And
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying I think that that's the
Yeah.
problem, is
Yeah, yeah.
trying to define one in terms of the other gets you into these situations where
Yeah.
you have to admit either you can do a dishonest and honest act in one and the same action, or you have to distinguish between what counts as, being trustworthy versus being honest.
Yeah. Yeah. We see it as a virtue of the account that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And then the second case.
When you're being trusted to do something that's just like not a norm.
It's just not trust
Oh
in the
yeah,
Holly
it's not.
case.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's just not trust in it's reliance, but trust requires reliance plus some further factor.
No,
And that
like the
further-
normative expectations
Yeah.
built on the rules that govern the behavior. So
Yeah,
like,
the person the colleague who's counting on you to eat their lunch that you didn't eat leftovers or bring the wine or for the wine or whatever, they're relying on you. They're not trusting you to do that.
Okay.
you can
Does that
have
make
the
sense?
attitude of trust, but it might not be warranted by the norms. So like, if the person is expecting their colleagues to bring them champagne, but there are no such norms or conventions that underlie the delivery of champagne to colleagues on such and such an occasion, then yeah, they trust, but it's not warranted.
So on your account, would they still be acting dishonestly then? Because
The colleagues are failing to deliver the champagne?
yeah.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, please.
Are you pointing to me?
Oh, I was pointing to you.
But it's
Thanks very much for the talk. So I think this is just about when you're motivating the view and you're saying that these three things, intention, falsehood, and some kind of representational aspect, don't apply to honesty in all cases. So I guess I was just wondering if we sort of open up the understanding of what it means, first of all, to intentionally lie or misrepresent. Then it looks like the kind of motivation you're giving might start to dissipate a little bit, maybe. So you have the case of the learning difficulties with Alison. So she cooks up this conspiracy that her daughter is not being taught or treated in the right way because she's trying to avoid accepting this other thing. So I just don't, it seems to me that even though she's not consciously saying, right, I need to block out this belief, so I'm going to believe these other things.
Yes.
It still seems that we could describe her actions or what she goes on to do as intentional, right? It's just not conscious intention. And I think on Christian's view, he will open up it that way. And I guess I didn't really feel the second thing as well when you say that she's bullshitting. So I'm not an expert on bullshit, but it seems to me like she really, really cares about the truth. Like that's motivating everything, right? And she's not just spewing out these things sort of randomly. She's spewing out these things to convince herself of that her daughter doesn't have learning. So at least on those two things, as soon as we open the case up a bit and we allow that the intention doesn't have to be conscious, then it looks like something like the lying model might fit a little better.
Awesome.
No, sir.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yes, I agree with you that the way that Mealy sets up the case, we can disambiguate the case in two ways. We can say, like, here's one version of the learning difficulties case where Allison is like, okay, I'm going to acquire the belief that the teacher is mistreating my daughter, and I am going to acquire the belief that that the material is ill-chosen and so on, right? And like, if those aren't true, then lying model to the rescue, right? That explains the dishonesty. The dishonesty isn't in the suspension of belief. It's in the means by which, the belief-based means by which she suspends her belief, right? But I think there's another way you can think about the case. You imagine that her evidence doesn't settle whether the material is well chosen, and it doesn't settle whether or not the teacher is treating her daughter properly. Those are just possibilities, right? And those beliefs are true. It might be the case by Allison's lights that the teacher is mistreating her daughter. In that case, she can, by focusing on these true possibilities, or at least possibilities left open by her evidence, she can convince herself to suspend belief on the basis of those with no misrepresentation. Because by her lights, by stipulation, her evidence leaves open these possibilities.
It still seems like she's distorting the facts, right? Insofar as the facts that the evidence counts sort of 75% in favor of one thing, she's spitting out all these possibilities, and by taking these possibilities seriously, she's sort of covering up the fact that the evidence overwhelmingly leads to her to in the direction that she should believe that her daughter has learning difficulties. But it still seems like it's distorting.
I guess what you're pointing to is that we locate the dishonesty in the suspension, which is not a representational state, it's the absence of a state. And you are pointing to ways in which we might locate it elsewhere that seem more directly tied to the lying model. Is that right?
Yeah, we have some follow-up on that point.
He also had a second part to his question.
Oh, sorry.
Which was?
Bullshit.
Bullshit. Oh yeah. I like the piece of the part the bit about the part of the Frankfurt analysis of bullshit that I want to echo here is not caring enough about the truth. And like that's when the salesperson is giving the pitch that they know to be true, they just don't care about it. What accounts for the fact that they're bullshitting, even though they're bullshitting truly, is that they don't care enough for the truth. And so you said, in this case, it looks like Allison cares a whole lot about the truth that her daughter is experiencing learning difficulties. Okay, so I mean, maybe this move is too clever by half, but like, let's distinguish between caring about the truth de dicto and caring about it de re. And so she cares about a de re truth, but she doesn't care about the truth as such, at least not in this case, because she's letting her anxieties cloud that desire.
She cares more about love than, put it more picturesquely, less clever, cares more about love than the truth. And so she's a bullshitter. She counts as a bullshitter because of that.
I like to talk about that later.
Follow-up?
Yeah, follow-up-ish. So I don't buy the case. We can talk about, I don't think it gets you all the things you want it to do. We can
The Allison
discuss
case?
later. But the representational one is the one I want to dial in. Okay. So I'm just skeptical that suspension actually happens frequently, if ever. I mean, there's this, do you know these Gilbert studies to motivate the kind of Spinozan view of belief?
No.
Where belief formation is pretty active.
Margaret Gilbert?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So there's this stuff, and then you make notice with Eric Mandelbaum stuff on the psychological immune system.
Yes.
He kind of built on this too, where it's just like, no, you kind of just slot it into the belief or the disbelief. And the kind of motivated reasoning that you're describing the parent is doing, like how Cartesian of her to implausibly, in my mind, arrive at like, okay, I shall suspend belief, having explored all of these alternative possibilities.
Right.
So it just seems implausible to me that's going to actually happen in these types of cases. That they're going to arrive at, I think we have some empirical reason to think that they'll arrive at disbelief as opposed to a suspension of belief. So
is disbelief the belief in the falsehood?
Just not believing that there's because what was the case is about a learning.
Her daughter's in trouble. Kind of thing.
Yeah, so disbelief that there's any kind of learning issue, as opposed to suspension of the question of whether or not there's a learning issue.
You've got a subtler lock on the distinction between those attitudes than I do. Like what disbelief is not belief that she's not, belief in the falsehood.
Believing Believing the falsehood, yeah.
Believing the falsehood.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So it's still representational because
Okay.
it's not psychologically realistic in my mind to think that she just gets to this.
Okay, cool.
This very.
And maybe she'll be reticent to assert this falsehood that she believes, or this false claim that she believes. But she's still, if you really tap into the brain, it's in there lurking.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think so. So the question I had is similar to one that was asked earlier, and it's just this concern about the account maybe counting too many acts as being dishonest, and maybe I guess I'll put it as kind of follow up to that question, and asking for maybe a little bit more about how you're thinking about the norms. So I think that your move in response to the question leans on some ideas you have about when we have norms. So like in the champagne case, it sounded like you wanted to say, even though there's this sort of customary thing going on with bringing the champagne, that somehow there's not a norm there. And I was so I'm wondering, like, why isn't there a norm, and can you construct other cases where it's like even more tempting to think that there is a norm, like just that it's just like a common business practice that you expect people to produce at a certain level. Maybe they're in a sales firm, and if they don't achieve that level, then they're out, right?
Right.
And so, is there a norm there, and is the trust violated when someone doesn't perform well enough, and so thereby they've been dishonest? And that seems like didn't seem like there was necessarily had to be dishonesty there. Similar kind of case, your partner comes and asks, how do I look in this outfit? And well, you might think there's a norm of like be positive and supportive, tell them they look beautiful, and so if you you're thinking, no, actually it's not so flattering on you, but you tell them that they look great anyway, then that won't count. So the concern is that wouldn't count as dishonest, because like the relevant norm is be supportive, and they're trusting you to support them in that way. But it seems like no, that's like a paradigmatically dishonest sort of behavior. So just inviting a little more commentary about the how you're thinking about the norms.
Can I take the first part and you take the second part?
Sure.
As far as the norms, our primary case was thinking of them as constitutive. So in the bringing the wine to work case, doing so regularly isn't going to constitute some kind of action of like wine bringing or something like that. It's just there's a pattern, there's a regularity, but it's not constitutive of like some kind of event or action or something like that. So there's not going to be a norm violation there. That's how.
In the way that like
instance,
norms constitute games, you might
Right.
think norms constitute speech. You might think norms constitute belief in certain ways.
So what do you think then about like the business case? Is it constitute like how we do business? Or?
Like, could there be what would have to be true in order for the person to be dishonest? Like, you've got this intuition, like.
Well, my thought was like, my thought is that if someone, the CEO is entrusting them to perform at a certain level, and they fail to perform at that level, and there's an expectation that bring in that much sales. It just doesn't seem to me like they would have had to have been dishonest there.
So let me just tweak the case a little bit, right? Okay. Suppose that like you've been at this real estate firm for a long time, right? And you sell a lot of land and houses and whatnot. And there's a kind of status that you can achieve if you're a good seller. You can be a closer, right? You can always be closing. And people can know you as a closer, right? Like, and like only closers get to wear blazers, right? Like, if you purport to be a closer, and maybe purporting to be a closer could be just as much as like sticking around after you haven't made your sales quota, where there's a norm of like quitting out of shame, then that could be kind of dishonest. Like, he's a closer? What is like? He didn't even make his quota last. And so what explains the difference? And so in that, I'm gonna say, yes, I bite the bullet. That person's being dishonest. And what accounts for the difference between the case that you raised, which I agree, there's no dishonesty in the case that I just described, is that, there's a status that's constituted by some norms and some expectations, being a closer. And then you're violating those norms. And that's what accounts for the dishonesty. But there has to be like this robust practice that people are relying on each other, blah, blah, blah.
Dan?
Just a follow-up, the language to describe that case that's common in management is you have trustworthiness based on ability, benevolence, and integrity. And so I think it's easier to think about honesty through the benevolence and integrity, you know, failures of those,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
leads to dishonesty. But the case Brian brings is when you fail to be trustworthy because of ability, in this case, a lack of ability to do the sales. And that seems, but you violated the trustworthiness, right? The person couldn't depend on you to deliver. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Trustworthiness is about you making your trust being you are vulnerable to that person.
Yeah.
Right? And so that, I don't know if that model or distinguishing when honesty should be kind of conflated or linked closely to trust and when it shouldn't be, in that
Yeah.
case of the ability, we fail to be trustworthy because of ability rather than honesty or integrity. That might be a helpful way to.
Right. And so you're like not blameworthy because you did your best, and so that doesn't seem to track with the fact that you're dishonest at all, right? Is that the thought?
Right.
Great. Yes. But in this case, what constitutes the dishonest action is not the failure to sell, but the sticking around and not getting fired. Because you could choose to quit, you know, and so not be in the shoes of a closer when you're not a closer.
The question I wanted to ask, can it be, so I share some of the concerns about promoting honesty and trustworthiness, but what I like about your model is that it's relational. So what I like about Sungwoo's model as well, and I was curious actually your thoughts on how they differ. So it's respect not to, for the right not to be deceived versus trustworthiness, and they're both sort of relational. And I was thinking through both conceptually, but maybe even applied to your specific example with AI, if you get to different conclusions through your view versus Sungwoo's, and maybe that's a broader question, but I was trying to think through the differences in models.
I mean, I might just want to take Sungwoo's model on board. I'm like not that. When we were writing this, we played around with like talking about depending on agreements, like trying to draw on the social contract tradition rather than on trustworthiness. And I think like violating an implicit agreement might do the same work that I think violating trust does. Like when you play golf, you've made this implicit agreement to abide by the rules, and when you play golf with the intention to cheat, you're entering into an agreement in bad faith, and so you're violating those rules. So if it's about respect for not being deceived or something like that, where that's a slightly different attitude than trust, I'm happy to take that on board. The trust part, although it's the part that we foreground, is still the part I'm trying to refine and make it fit these kinds of troubling cases that people have presented. And so I mean, respect is a nice attitude, so is agreement. Maybe those would do better. But I want to do something very similar, which is what accounts, conventions and the norms that arise from conventions are the thing that find unity between the dishonesty that happens in stealing, lying, and cheating. And so I want to ground an attitude on those norms and have violations of that attitude or infringements of that attitude be what constitutes the dishonesty. And that attitude could be respect for, or it could be an agreement, or it could be trust. We're playing around with that.
Okay, we don't have time. We have to go to lunch, so let's all thank Nikki Nathan.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.